Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started for one of our 11:30 briefings today, and we're going to be speaking about some specific issues around police reform. As you can imagine, with respect to what's happening right now, we're getting a lot of questions about that, so we're going to kind of go through a little bit of an update on where we're at on a number of issues. But first, I just want to mention that, of course, we're experiencing right here in Albuquerque and around the nation. This is a pivotal moment in our city and in our state and around our country. And I know the deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and many, many before them have left people heartbroken and angry. This is something that, as mayor, I want to continue to acknowledge that pain. And I also want to make sure that we're trying to do what we can to do something about it. And in Albuquerque, we have a long, long way to go, but we have been doing some things. And so we're going to update folks on that now. Now, as mayor, we have, in my administration, we've been steering this effort to restore trust between APD and our people. And we know that it was very, very much eroded. And we know that in many ways it's still challenged. But we've tried to continue to build that trust. And it's fragile. It's extremely fragile. And it's something that has to be earned over decades. You don't rebuild trust overnight. But I do know we are in a little bit better place than we were 5 years ago. And it's because of some of the things that we'll touch on today. But we have so far to go. Now, I also want to mention that for us, it's not just about all of our work engaging neighborhood leaders and business owners and people and our officers and even their families. But it's also about how we respond to these events. And so we've talked about our approach. And we want to make sure that we continue to, we know we have to stick to our values, we know we have to progress, and we have to stay at this with resolve. And that includes reform, but it also means peaceful protest. And it means, again, respecting that right to protest, but also if there is any violence, any gunshots, we absolutely have to keep the protesters safe and everyone else. And that's what our department will try and do. Now, we've heard from hundreds of people in our office and in others about this notion of 8 can't wait. And so if you don't know about that, you can look it up. It's hashtag 8 can't wait. And this has been a campaign that's been around. We've also heard a lot about the Obama Foundation's recent town hall. This came up a lot. And so we're going to speak about some of our reforms in the context of 8 can't wait. And we also want to let folks know that, you know, where we're at on each one of these initiatives. And for us, you know, this is actually, 8 Can't Wait is just a small piece of a much, much larger set of reforms that our department has been working on. And we know that it's a very, very lengthy reform process. It started several years ago. But I think a big difference is that, you know, when the DOJ first came in, it was because of use of force. Let's just remind everyone, we had major use of force issues, so bad that our department actually consented at the time with the courts and with the Department of Justice to be under a consent decree explicitly for use of force. So for us, this issue has been around before. It's still around, but we are under, again, this consent decree, and there have been initiatives that we've been working on. And our administration started with a different approach. Initially, there was strong resistance, I think, at all levels to the reforms with respect to use of force in the DOJ. Our administration took a very different approach. We said we are going to lean into this and we are going to get it done as fast as we can, but we understand fast in this world because we're talking about culture change, about actual systems change. It takes years and years, but we are committed to doing that. And we'll talk about where we're at on that process. Now, for us, we believe in putting the focus on community-based policing. We created a dedicated compliance bureau that we did not have before. This matters because of accountability. We now have mechanisms in place for accountability for actions in our city. We did not have that before. And we also do it in a transparent way that is overseen by multiple agencies. The challenge is it does take a long time. There is no doubt about that. However, there is a high level of independence, relatively speaking, and transparency, relatively speaking, in our department now that was both not there before and not in many other departments around the country. So for us, we also reformed our internal investigations division, and we did overhaul our use of force policy. This was one of the biggest changes that we made, and our officers have been through the associated training with that. So we are in a much, much different place, literally, than we were 3 years ago when it comes to our use of force policy. And I think also critically, APD initiated the peer-to-peer ethical policing training program. This is where officers hold each other accountable for appropriate use of force. And so this is something, again, that just doesn't exist in many other cities. We do have it here now. And hopefully what that means is that no officer would ever stand by and watch what he or she saw, what we saw in Minneapolis. Based on everything we've put in place, officers would have stopped other officers doing that on the scene. Now, last year, we also finished a lengthy review of the input processes we use in that use of force policy. And these include the 8 areas that are in the 8 Can't Wait program. Now you can see the icons up here that represent, this is from the organization 8 Can't Wait. You can see the 8 principles here. And you can see also a very meaningful statistic there. I mean, literally one life makes this matter. But you can see that even over time, it obviously can affect many, many, many lives. And so for us, we actually, and by the organization's own statistics, we are at 6 out of 8 on these we have said yes to. And we will continue to work on the remaining 2. I want to mention again that we're trying to do more than 8 Can't Wait. But I think at least on this particular framework that has been shown, we are right now 6 out of 8 on this framework measure. So for us too, I want to mention that we also know that we have created some institutions that matter, and we're going to hear from some of these. Now, which we did not have before in an effective way, we have a civilian oversight board for our police department. We're going to hear from the head of that. We also know that we have citizen policing councils. Their job is to advise on policies just like this. They're one of these, I think there's 6 of them all around the city. We do need more members for that, and we also need much more diversity on those. But those avenues, those channels exist. And of course, for all reforms and change, we are under a court order. So these are reviewed by a judge. And there also, of course, an independent federal monitor is watching all of this, which regularly reports on it. And I want to remind folks, even just to get the 6 done that we have, that has included advocacy groups, APD Forward and others who are part of that court-mandated agreement process. So we're just letting folks know where we're at on this, because we've been asked heavily about these questions. And I think at least in our city, we know that there's a long, long road to go, but we're committed to taking that journey together. And we can at least demonstrate that we've been doing that, but we've got to do it faster and we have to do it better. Now to speak more about this, our CAO, Sarita Nair. Sarita.
Thank you, Mayor. 6 years ago, Albuquerque chose a path, and it was the path of reform. And it was not a unanimous choice in our city. It's hard to remember that time. But the department and the city administration were not always rowing in the same direction. And watching from the outside, we thought that when we got here, we needed to hit the accelerator on reform. But when we actually came into office, we realized that we were not just stalled. We were actually heading in the wrong direction. And much of that conflict came to a head in November 2017, which feels like a lifetime ago, but was actually only 3 years ago. And I called Deputy Chief Eric Garcia at that time when he was the APD voice in court who was speaking out for the need to truly engage in reforms. And I actually had known him from being the officer who was the most committed to the rape kit audit process. He showed up for every meeting, and he was always willing to accept that mistakes had been made and we had work to be done. We told him that we were going to need his leadership to get reform headed in the right direction. And thank goodness he answered that call and said yes. A few weeks later, we named him to lead the newly created Compliance Bureau, as the mayor discussed, and we have some other folks from that bureau here today. Now, when we got here, as the mayor mentioned, we had a use of force policy, and that is the heart of all police reform. But it was a policy that no one could use or understand. And again, we were not just stalled. We needed to stop the process, turn it around, and make up lost ground before we even got back to the start line. Fortunately, at that point, everyone agreed. The monitor, the DOJ, the union, and the department worked together to reformulate a use of force policy that was understandable, trainable, and able to be monitored so people could be held accountable. It took over a year. Now, why did it take so long? Well, we have a policy process that ensures thorough review and input from a broad cross-section of stakeholders. We have this sort of colorful process map that shows, I'm not going to read this to you, but more for the impact of how many steps there are and how many boxes there are. We don't take policy change lightly in this department. And then it took time to get it trained, it took time to get it implemented, and now we're taking the time to see how reforms are working in the field. And we'll continue to review this in other policies while all policies are living documents and need to change and evolve as we use them. So it is great that 8 Can't Wait and other organizations are having a national conversation about policing policies. It's also great that we have already been in that conversation for many years. We know that this is not a linear process. It's not like we implement 8 policies and violence decreases by 72% overnight. It's a long road. It's about training and learning through that training that we missed a detail on a key point and then we got to go back and fill that in. It's about observing the policy violations that occur to understand where things are going wrong. And it's also about investment. It's investment in personnel, in building up the internal affairs division, actually into 2 divisions, one that investigates force and one that investigates professional standard violations. It's about civilian data analysts, and it's about the other programs we have that aren't directly related to reform but are part of community policing, including the Violence Intervention Program, the RAD program that focuses on restorative justice. It's about investing in our on-body recording devices to make sure that those are working when officers are properly following policy, investing in electronic control weapons that have an audit trail so that we can go back and see whether they're being tested and used and deployed properly. There's just a lot of money and investment that we've been fortunate to be able to have, to direct, and have the support of City Council to invest in reform and all the pieces around it. So we finally have the data and the people to do this work, including an internal audit division that keeps scorecards on everything from body camera use to electronic control weapon deployment. And I just want to be clear, though, we are still not in sight of the end, but we are also not at the beginning. And we welcome the opportunity for the community to be involved, whether that is through the community policing councils, the police oversight board process, or peaceful protest. Now, speaking of those processes, I'm going to turn it over to Ed Harness, who leads the Civilian Police Oversight Agency. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nair and Mayor Keller. I think at first I would like to acknowledge the progress that has happened with the department under Mayor Keller's leadership. As was stated before, it was a stalled process, and the city decided to lean in, and great progress has been made. As far as the use of force policy, I just want to address that specifically because it is time for its review, even though it just went live 6 months ago, these use of force changes. So we will be collecting the data from that use of force, from that new use of force policy, and we will be including that in our review. I would also like to discuss the fact that we are involved in policy development from the Civilian Police Oversight Board as an entity. We are a part of the Office of Policy Analysis. We are also a part of the Policies Procedures Review Board, where we have voting rights for policies as they come for review. When this last use of force policy was being developed, and Ms. Nair mentioned it took a year, the CPOA board had special meetings to collect public comment, and they will do that again if necessary. But we would encourage the public to become involved as soon as those policies appear on the CPOA board agenda. Also, we would like you to become involved with the community policing councils, as the community policing councils will be reviewing these policies as well. And that is a spot for you to have direct input. And if you decide that you want to be a voting member on those community policing councils, you will have direct input to the department on the use of force policies as we review them and as we take a look at the data that we have from those policies. Once that policy is ready and has gone through the development process, as Ms. Nair pointed out, it will still go to the Department of Justice and the monitor because of the consent decree. Regarding the Black Lives Matter protests, I just want to make a couple of points. There are allegations that APD briefed armed civilians. I have been in contact with the department, and our agency will conduct that investigation. Also, there are allegations that teens were illegally detained after one of these protests. If you have information regarding either of those events, you can call 924-3770, or you can email us at cpoa@cabq.gov and bring us information. I requested information Wednesday night when I was at the Human Rights Board meeting. I continue to ask for that information. You can come forward anonymously with that information so that we can conduct a full and proper investigation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your leadership, Director Harness. And again, we want to highlight these avenues and channels that do truly provide oversight and accountability for our department. We know often it can take frustratingly a long amount of time, but we do believe there are actual channels for real accountability. And we just heard about probably the most significant one. But there are some other pieces as well that we have put in place. And one of them is our work with, of course, the APD's policy review process from a legal perspective. And so we're going to hear from the woman who's really in charge of that process, our city attorney for APD reform, Lindsay Van Meter. Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My name is Lindsay Van Meter, and I am the Managing Assistant City Attorney who oversees the CASA case, which is the case in which the United States Department of Justice sued the city of Albuquerque for excessive police force back in 2014. I'm thrilled to be a part of this transformation process, and thank you for letting me speak today. I want to take a step back and talk about what the case is as a whole and what it looks like to go through one of these cases. There are 4 major steps to one of these cases, and the first step is developing policy. And then it goes far beyond that. Then you have to train on that policy. You have to implement that policy in the field and hold officers accountable when they fail to comply with that policy. And then you have to maintain and show that you can do this over a substantial period of time. And so APD has now basically done 2 to 3, depending on where you're at, and in some cases 4 of these policies. We have 278 requirements under this consent decree. And so they're all at different stages. So for the use of force, that policy, when the mayor took office, was, as Ms. Nair said, it was not where it needed to be. It was broken. Officers couldn't implement it correctly. It frankly had exceptions where it needed to have clarity. So that policy was developed. And it went through a very long policy development process, which I'm going to describe in some detail. And I'm going to talk then about what was changed and the input that we had. So to develop a policy, APD assigns a subject matter expert. And in this case, the expert is our Internal Affairs Force Division Commander. And the expert reviews the data regarding implementation of the policy. That's the first step. They look at use of force reports. They look at the internal affairs process. They look at what input we've received from the public. They get input from officers. They get input from stakeholders, such as the individual groups that were allowed to intervene in the CASA case, including the APOA, and then the individuals who were allowed to represent community interests in the CASA case, who we call our stakeholders and amici. APD's subject matter expert revises the policy with the help of expert policy writers, and with help from the legal department to make sure that it complies with all the legal requirements of a use of force policy. APD provides notice of the revised policy to the public on its webpage, and it accepts comments. For any policy that impacts individuals with behavioral health issues, APD provides that to a group called MRAC, the Mental Health Response Advisory Committee. Those are civilians who are experts at treating individuals with behavioral health issues. APD then presents that revised policy at an open meeting called the Office of Policy Analysis meeting. Stakeholders are invited and are asked to provide comment. APD then continues to take public comment and provides the policy to its officers and requests their comment. Based on all these comments, and this takes several months, the policy is revised and then presented to what's called the Policy and Procedure Review Board. And as Mr. Harness said, the Civilian Police Oversight Agency has votes on that board, as does the Civilian Police Oversight Agency Board. The Police Officers Association has a vote, and then 5 officers from different areas have votes. The policy is then provided officially, even though it's already been received by them, to the CPOA and the CPOA board. And then they have a 30-day comment period. And then they go toward the tail end of that period to the monitor and the Department of Justice for their comments and reviews. So as you can see, there is a lot of input from stakeholders in this policy process. We took extra steps as we were developing the last policy on uses of force. The Office of Policy Analysis meeting was held at the CPOA board meeting. It was televised, and there was substantial opportunity for public comment. We held several meetings with the amici, which are the group who get to intervene in the court case, and they reviewed the policies and provided feedback. And then several drafts went back and forth with the Department of Justice and the Monitor and the APOA. There are some big takeaways from the development of our use of force policy. The very first requirement is that officers make every effort to preserve the sanctity of human life in every situation. It's far more restrictive than the constitutional minimum set forth in the Graham case. It requires officers to be able to clearly articulate the facts demonstrating that they used the minimum amount of force necessary that was reasonable and proportional. And it requires officers to be effecting a lawful objective in order to use force. Finally, officers are investigated for every use of force now, and that wasn't done before. So this is a very thorough process. It goes all the way up to the Force Review Board, which is staffed by the department chiefs and deputy chiefs, excuse me, to make sure that our policies are reviewed again and that the training is good and that the policy doesn't need any changes. And now that we have data from the implementation of our policy for the last 4 months, it's being reviewed again. So we welcome all of the public input in the next round of revisions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over back to the mayor. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Lindsay, for that. And, you know, I think as folks can see, you know, it is a long, long process, but it's because of ensuring that input. There are hundreds of people involved in this process from the public in dozens of different channels. And so this is something that was, again, set up when this agreement was designed. But I do want to mention that it makes that learning process unfortunately slow, but also real. And I think that's an important trade-off that we're facing right now. It's one thing for us to go up and talk about how we want to do the right things. But this administration is committed to trying to actually make change. And that is not easy, and that takes actually doing everything that Lindsay mentioned. And so that to us is a higher calling. It's actual change, not just talking about it and not just giving it lip service or doing a study or doing research. But it also means that this process is just excruciatingly time-consuming. So the other gentleman in charge of this is our Deputy Chief Garcia, and he plays a very, very key role. We created a compliance bureau so that there was internal accountability. So we've been talking about external accountability. There's also internal accountability and compliance mechanisms that are very relevant to 8 Can't Wait. And so for us, again, we have channels where we believe accountability can actually occur. That's very different than before. And it's because of the work of DC Garcia. Now, DC Garcia.
Thank you, Mayor. As the mayor stated earlier, when he came into office, he created the Compliance Bureau, which I think was extremely important because this bureau is dedicated strictly to the reforms from the Department of Justice. Our first task was to repair the relationships we had with the community, with the independent monitoring team, and the Department of Justice. We worked collaboratively with these groups to get their input and to work together to move forward. And I think the biggest commitment we made was also to work with the community, because we realized the community, we serve the community. That's the most important people in this whole process, and that's why we're in this consent decree, is because of what the community wanted and the community demanded it. We meet regularly with the amici groups and the public to get their input on every stage of what we're doing. We update them on what we're doing. And what we realized is that they provide a lot of positive, great information that us as police officers may not necessarily see. So it's that community collaboration that has worked extremely well. And as the mayor said, we're moving forward, and we look forward to continually working with the community. As far as the 8 Can't Wait movement, I think it's fantastic. I think it's a long time coming. I think hopefully some of these other departments in the country will come to our level, because I believe we are headed in the right direction, and we are ahead of other departments, and I'm very proud of that fact. We'll go through each one of the 8 on the list. The ban chokeholds and strangleholds. Our policy does not allow for any neck holds, chokeholds, strangleholds of any kind. I think that was important. That was actually in the settlement agreement, in the consent decree. We required de-escalation. We thought de-escalation was so important to our department and our community that created its own standard operating procedure section dealing specifically with de-escalation. Require warnings before shooting. Yes, that's in there. That's a requirement for the officers in the department. Duty to intervene. As the mayor said, the chief brought over a program from the New Orleans Police Department. It's called EPIC. Ethical Policing is Courageous. And what it does is it encourages and requires officers to intervene if another officer is doing something they shouldn't, whether it be unlawful or against policy. And that goes for regardless of rank. So I think that's very important. Require the use of force continuum. As far as that number goes, we require our force to be reasonable, necessary, and proportional, and be the minimum amount of force necessary. And that's a standard we worked with the community. We worked with the standard with the independent monitoring team and the Department of Justice when we developed this policy. And require comprehensive reporting. I think it's been stated earlier that our reporting requirements for use of force by officers in our department is very stringent. We probably have the most strict reporting policy of just about any department in the country to hold officers accountable for any use of force, whether it be in policy or out of policy uses of force. I'd like to go to the 2 now out of the 8 on that list that we are working on. One is exhausting all alternatives before shooting. That kind of goes towards the de-escalation segment. We are working on that. Officers need to use several things before they use lethal force of the firearm. They need to use cover, concealment, distance, all available resources, and we give them the tools to be able to handle the situation effectively. Our CIT program, the Crisis Intervention Team program, and our enhanced Crisis Intervention Team program is one of the best in the country. It allows officers these additional skills to communicate with an individual in crisis. So that's extremely important, and we are continuing to work on that one. On the other one that on the 8th that we're working on is ban shooting at motor vehicles, moving vehicles. Currently, officers are not allowed to shoot at a moving vehicle or from a moving vehicle unless that person is using deadly force against the officer or another person. And that's the only exception to that. But officers cannot, for any other reason, shoot at a moving vehicle. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to the mayor.
Thank you so much, Deputy Chief, and appreciate your work on each one of those items. We'll take questions here in just a minute. I think I would just emphasize that because of the work of Director Harness, of all the different advocacy groups that are a part of this process, as well as our DC, we know our department inevitably makes mistakes, and we basically hope that those mistakes get smaller and less severe, and that we learn from them so that they're not repeated. And I think at least over the last couple of years, we can really demonstrate actually doing that. Now, with that, let me see if there's questions from folks, and we'll direct it to the appropriate person.
Why are those two policies, why haven't they been implemented yet?
So the question is, out of the 8 policies, and we mentioned that 6 of them are in place, and we're working on 2 of them. The question is, why aren't they quite there? I think you can see there has been lots of progress on them. One thing that's interesting about 8 Can't Wait is they're very definitive. I mean, they're very sort of yes or no. And so our DC articulated that we're close, but we're not there. And anything else you two would like to add? Yeah.
Yes, we are working on those, and I like to call Commander Middleton, Robert Middleton. He's our commander in charge of our Internal Affairs Force Division. As stated earlier, he's the architect of this use of force policy suite, and he can give you a little better understanding of those and where we are in this process. I do want to add that these policies do come up for review yearly, and we are currently reviewing these policies as we speak.
And another question if you could maybe answer when you respond is the reason we can't cross off the ban shooting and moving vehicles because of the leeway we do have, that little, is that why we can't cross it off entirely?
I can address that one first. So the banning shooting at moving vehicles, Deputy Chief Garcia already stated that, but if there is a moving vehicle occupied by an assailant, somebody armed with a gun, or committing some sort of an immediate threat towards others or police, other than the vehicle itself. So the officer has a duty to get out of the way of the vehicle. They cannot place themselves in the path of a vehicle to stop a vehicle. They can't use any means to stop that vehicle or move out of a position of cover, which means a hard object like a concrete pole or something like that, to get in front of the vehicle or give a signal to stop. But if there is something happening in that vehicle that poses an immediate threat, like if shots are actively being fired at the police officer has a duty to protect themselves. And the language in this is shooting at the moving vehicle. A police officer is still not going to shoot at the vehicle. They're not going to shoot at the engine block, the tires, the paneling. They're there to stop the threat, and the threat is not the vehicle itself. It would be the person or the assailant in the vehicle causing that immediate threat. It's not spelled out that explicitly, but the language in our policy does ban shooting at moving vehicles with that exception. And then, like the Deputy Chief said too, we're in the 6-month review process for use of force policy. We're more than open to receiving feedback from the public to provide that explicit language in there, because we understand what it means, just like I explained to you. But the specific language with community input could, provide more of a benefit or more of the language that the officers need to understand it. And then the exhausting all alternatives before shooting. We did, when we wrote this use of force policy suite, we intentionally placed a standalone de-escalation policy in that suite. And de-escalation isn't just communication. It's not just providing that communication to a person, trying to slow things down, but it also includes putting time, distance, cover, concealment, or intermediate barriers in between the officer and then whatever else is going on. By doing that, they can request additional resources, additional police officers, another supervisor, additional resources from the RTC to put time on their side so they can prevent or eliminate the need to use force. And this all applies to non-lethal use of force incidents. Sometimes during the lethal use of force incidents, it's such an immediate reaction to, like I said earlier, something like an assailant or something that poses an immediate threat to that police officer. An officer cannot go through a continuum or use of force options before that deadly force. And once again, we're more than open to receiving feedback from the public and how to articulate that in the use of force policy. Thanks.
Am I okay to ask another?
I mean, we'll get you all in. Maybe we'll take Jessica and go back to you. Is that all right? Just
Yeah, I think the DOJ monitor, in his most recent report, didn't he talk about the counter CASA effect and whether things are actually happening at the ground level despite the policy? Are you seeing any sort of resistance at the ground level, and what are you doing to combat that? When you make these policy changes that are written out, are they playing out in the streets?
So one of the challenges with these reforms, obviously, is you, depending on your position in the city, you sort of set policies, et cetera, and then what really matters is behavior changing on the front line, and that is something that actually is the hardest and last step in the DOJ reform process, because they acknowledge that that's the kind of the hardest thing. So you have to set all this in place around folks and then hold behavior accountable. We can hold behavior accountable. That is one good thing. But whether or not there's challenges to that, probably our CAO can speak to that. And there are always challenges to any change effort, and that's no different in this case.
Thanks, Mayor. So I would agree with the mayor's analysis. So the monitor has spoken about counter CASA culture, and it's not different than any other police department going through reform in the country. There is always that reluctance to change. I mean, I had a counter DocuSign culture in the city hall where people didn't want to move to electronic routing of documents, so you can imagine changing everything about the way you do your job in police reform. But our approach to tackling that concern has been data-driven. So this is where our internal audit division within APD has really become key, because we said, okay, out of the folks who aren't complying, let's really understand who's not complying because they don't understand, who's not complying because nobody's really paying attention or making sure that they comply and correcting it over and over again so it becomes habit. And then we'll be able to isolate that true counter CASA culture. And in our next, hopefully soon, we'll be allowed to present in court again, but we actually have a lengthy presentation, which we ran out of time to do in our last DOJ presentation, but about the effect that these report cards essentially have had on compliance in the field. It's been kind of amazing. So area commanders are being held accountable for policy compliance within their area command, and then also in the other tactical units, those commanders are also being held accountable. And we saw a lot of those report cards change from red to green really quickly with A, training, and then with B, that little slice of accountability. No area commander really wanted to have the lowest score in the class, so to speak, and we do present that data to them on a weekly basis and side by side with their peers. So those two things have helped us really move the needle on policy change and understand where there might be actual resistance. And then the approach in every department across the country to that true resistance is discipline. And so the work that Commander Middleton's division does, the work that Internal Affairs, Professional Standards does, is all about holding people accountable when they truly are resistant. It's not a lack of understanding, it's not a lack of training, but it's true resistance to the policy. Those folks have to be held accountable. And we saw a great example of that last year with an officer who had thrown a detained person up against a wall. They were caught on videotape, but also another officer who was present at the time came forward and reported that incident in keeping with the EPIC training. Those are the kind of incidents that are going to need to happen. They're going to need to surface, and those officers have to be held accountable to really force that last piece of culture change.
On that front, do you know how many officers have been disciplined since the use of force policy was put into place for violating it?
I don't have those numbers right now.
We could get them for you.
Increased quite a bit since we've taken on that role, because it was partial down.
You can just follow up. Okay. She's print.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we've taken overall use of force investigations, and then any misconduct found within those use of force investigations, we own it. Whereas before, it went out to all the area commanders, it was parceled out everywhere. There was really no accountability system set up in there, so it went up quite a bit since we took it over. And I would say that we've identified everything in use of force events.
Yeah. That is all in the court documents. I know there's a lot to suss through, but we can help dig it up for you.
Over
related to that, we have a question here from Chris McKee with Care Community News. He said, 8 Can't Wait gives the city a passing grade on its SOP for reporting use of force and requiring investigations. But in the independent monitor's May report, he accused APD command staff of continuing to block or delay oversight processes until discipline timelines have passed, which, quote, prevents an effective remedial response to behavior that is clearly in violation of established policy. How do you respond to that particular criticism from the monitor?
So I think this was important input from the monitor, and again, it's an example of that feedback loop that we need to have. I think our CAO can probably speak directly to that particular aspect of it. I would just add that this is a situation where we actually know that that is an issue, and that is a big difference than we did before. We wouldn't even have known that was going on. We wouldn't even have had a way to work on it. And so that's a good example of sort of where we're at in the process.
You know, this is sort of akin to Jessica's question on the counter cost of culture. Specifically with respect to timelines, it absolutely was a problem. We discussed it in court. It was in the IMRs. But since January 11th of this year, which is the new monitoring period, we are actually in 100% compliance with the 120-day timeline. So that's some work by Deputy Chiefs Garcia and Commander Middleton's divisions that should really be celebrated.
Okay. Marissa?
Mayor, just a quick question. I'd like to get your opinion on this. I've heard this week some people say, Albuquerque has one of the most diverse forces in the country, which is great. But on the other hand, people say that just because we have brown and black bodies who are police officers out on the forefront doesn't mean that this fixes all the issues. Would you agree or disagree with those statements?
I think both those statements are true. We do have one of the more diverse forces, but that also doesn't solve a lot of these problems.
The governor touched base on this yesterday. She said she was going to look into it. But there's a well-known organizer, Miss Anila Guerrero. She claims on social media that her husband, Clifton White, was arrested for retaliation after being one of the organizers for the protest of last week on Thursday. She also says, and I quote, "I also learned APD contacted the young people from Thursday the night and tried to get them to press charges against Clifton for driving their car. Why is APD trying to manufacture charges against Clifton?"
So I think we're looking into this as well. I do know that whenever shots are fired, which was the case in this incident area, our officers do have to respond. And so this was in the context of shots being fired. And I also know that we would never tolerate direct retribution on a totally innocent protester in general. And so we've got to understand what happened. This is a good example where these kinds of incidents have multiple layers of review. So I'm sure that eventually more information is going to come out. And if there was something wrong, we'll hold folks accountable.
Mayor. There's a movement of activists who want to, quote, defund the police, move resources away from police departments to other areas. What do you think about that? Are you taking any steps in that direction with the next budget process?
So the question is about kind of this de-investment concept, and I think this is one where every city has to understand where they're at. Our department was underfunded in general, so we've been suffering from general underfunding, and it's gotten worse during Corona. So I think with the budget process, we're interested in all avenues. We are committed to investing in things like our restorative justice program. That's a new investment under us. Our violence intervention program, a new investment under us. All our training with respect to behavioral health and de-escalation, those are all investments we've made. And so right now, it's just something that, of course, we'll look at it through the budget process. That obviously has to go through council. But it is something that we also need to understand. Look, our department is totally underfunded. And that's been a case we've made for a long time. So we have to understand the Albuquerque context when we have that discussion.
Mayor, we have another question here from Kate O'Neill with GOV. This is a question for Deputy Chief Garcia, but of course you can answer it if you want. We're talking about de-escalation to avoid lethal force. Yesterday, APD was involved in an officer-involved shooting while responding to a mentally distressed individual. Can you speak to that issue?
I'll tee up DC Garcia for this, and the question, of course, about the incident that we had yesterday. And again, we'll remind folks that one of the things with Ed Harness's group and the court monitor and so forth, all of this will be combed over as every use of force is, and there will be transparency in that process as it has been over the last few years. And that also means, though, specifically, there are certain things that DC can cover and may not be able to, so I'll hand it over to him.
Yes, I don't have any specifics as to the incident itself other than what was already released to the media. De-escalation is a very big part of our program. Our CIT program, all officers in the department, field officers, are crisis intervention team trained. And then we have approximately a little over 200 officers who are enhanced crisis intervention team trained, ECIT trained. And whenever we get a mental health call, the priority is to send an enhanced CIT unit or a mobile crisis team, which we also have. The mobile crisis team is composed of an ECIT officer and a master's level clinician. And there are certain steps officers have to follow, as I stated earlier, and Commander Middleton did, of when officers arrive on scene to de-escalate a situation, to resolve it peacefully. We will look at this situation in depth, not only from the multi-agency task force that investigates any officer-involved shooting, to our Internal Affairs Force Division, who investigates the force, and also our Internal Affairs Professional Standards Division that will handle any other misconduct involved in that situation as well.
We have a few other questions related to, not related to this, but for you, Mayor. Related to the reopening of the city and the isotopes. This is from Chris McKee at KRQE News. We've heard that New Mexico United is restarting its season. We're still waiting on word from Albuquerque Isotopes. We heard that it's furloughed several of its employees. What is your response to those furloughs?
So just to clarify the questions about, I think, the United and the Isotopes. The furlough piece is about the isotopes?
Yes.
So, with respect to this, of course, we did hear that the leagues are the first layer of approval. So the United League gave them approval to begin play. Obviously, that'll have to take place under the auspice of a public health order at the time, which is still about a month away. So we'll see where things look like, and we'll be involved in discussions with them on that. Now, the isotopes, I believe the minor leagues has not made a decision. And so I think that's what we're all waiting for. So really, like, whether or not the furloughs are big or small, or they play or don't play, the first decision is going to be minor league baseball. And so really we're just on hold for that, and then we can certainly comment on what they say.
Okay, one more question on that. Usually every April, the city does a rent check ceremony with the isotopes for rental of the isotopes park. Has anything changed with the payment or the city's rental agreement?
Questions about the rent check that we get from Isotopes and the ceremony we usually do with that. It's hard to even remember things like that, but that is a tradition, and it obviously has not happened because of Corona. So I'll just have to check on it. No pun intended.
That's all the questions from Zoom, so if there aren't any in person, we're good. All right.
Okay, thanks everybody.